we were just talking about having sort of a progressive ideology, okay? Which means a lot of things in different areas, but it could mean something on the SCOTUS. Let's see if we can get an idea of what she thinks about different sort of issues that are, I would say, relevant in America today. So first, we have a tweet from John Haltwanger of Business Insider, who quoted her saying, "Racism persists in our country, but she won't put her finger on whether it's outright or systemic racism. She says these are policy questions that are beyond what she's capable of addressing as a judge." Thoughts?
I thought that was a blatant punt, because I think that that's more of an observation that you can make, whether it's structural racism, institutionalized, all of these forms of racism. And if she just said, you know what, I'm not a sociologist, I can't speak to that specifically, but from the context in which I know, and answer the question. But I can't see this as being something that she could have answered and not gotten in considerable trouble for from the conservative end. I think that this was a punt, and I don't think it was a legit one at all, that it was playing on party line.
Yeah, I feel like it's much like the comparison we made between the first two videos. This isn't about a hypothetical case, isn't about a specific case. Do you think that racism is baked into the structure of American government, American society, the American economy, those sorts of things? Now, your views on that could affect what you do as a justice. We could speculate about what effect that might have, but that's a fairly foundational thing about your understanding of America. And if you won't say that you think it's there, I think it's fair to assume that you don't think that it's there. And when she goes on to say that she cried with her family over the death of George Floyd and had to explain things about his killing, as if this was the first she'd heard of it, to me, it says a lot.
No, I know, because I was initially thinking, gosh, you hadn't had this conversation with your kids before. How are you going to be a parent to Black children, a Black little girl and boy, and not have had these conversations about racism? And also too, if you are anti-racist, why haven't you had this conversation with your white children too? So it did catch me off. And it was also, it really felt very performative for her to have her kids there to begin with. So to weaponize and to use them and to essentially convey in these subtle ways that I'm not racist because I have these two children I adopted from Haiti. You may be the nicest person ever and still have issues with unconscious bias. And to not acknowledge or recognize or show any appreciation for that is very problematic.
Yeah. Other things that might be problematic. Here's a quote from her having to do with the LGBTQ community. A quote, "I have never discriminated on the basis of sexual preference and would never discriminate on the basis of sexual preference," which this reporter acknowledges is not true because she was on the board of a school that refused to accept the children of same-sex couples. So it's just a lie. But in addition, I don't know what year it is. It's not a preference. It's not like I'm more of a hot dog than a hamburger kind of guy. I like red vines more than Twizzlers. This ain't about preference. This is about who you are and the rights that you have. And if you're using the language of decades ago, my fear, and you're participating in this discrimination, my fear is that that is what you actually think about this community. You think it's a bunch of people that have sort of a preference or whatever, which does not sound like the worldview that leads to you holding up those people's rights going forward. That would be my fear, Adrienne.
Oh, absolutely. For her to pretend that there's some kind of evolving preferential treatment kind of thought that I can do whatever I want with my sexual identity, as opposed to this being an orientation, that this is an immutable characteristic about myself that cannot change. It very much scares me because it speaks to the lens by which she will see gay, lesbian, LGBTQ trans rights, by thinking that this is a choice as opposed to a part of your identity and who you are. And so that is very scary. And that, I think, it is one of those reflection elements that make you think, wow, this person may be very smart, and wow, they may have this legal theory that they cast their lens through, but now she's showing her true bias.
She also said, and this is sort of related to that, she said this about this, but she said it about other things too. So asked about the possibility that a case coming before the Supreme Court that could hypothetically overturn the relatively recent nationwide right for same-sex marriage, she says the most likely result is that a case like that wouldn't make it to the Supreme Court. But she says if lower courts flout precedent, it could come back up. You're gonna be on the Supreme Court for decades past, when I hope to be flying around in spaceships, you're gonna be there for a while. Let's not like totally get into, I don't think it'll happen in the next 40 plus years. A lot can happen in that time. And she said this about a case that might overturn same-sex marriage. She said it about many things involving the ACA. She won't tell us much of what she thinks, except that she sure has thoughts about what would never make it before the Supreme Court. I mean, Adrian, Republicans aren't gonna be trying to get rid of same-sex marriage in 1 or 5 or 20 years. They'll have moved on by then.
You know what? I found that response that she gave to be very nonsensical, because the reality is that Trump has stacked the deck when we talk about judges. He's now appointed almost a quarter of all active federal judges in the United States. And as we recently saw with the DC Court of Appeals, that decision that initially came down, unfortunately, the name escapes me, but essentially you had a panel of 3 judges, 2 of whom were conservative, 1 appointed by Trump, where they totally issued a decision that was not consistent at all with the rules of the law. And the DC Court of Appeals had to come through and issue a ruling en banc to get rid of it. And that is a problem when you're going to have these Trump judges making rulings and decisions that are consistent with Trump's policy efforts as opposed to applying the exact law. And that is what's going to happen, where we will get judges who go ahead and say, yeah, let's go ahead and allow this law to go through that, hey, it oppresses LGBTQ. And then the next judge, oh yeah, sounds good. And then it gets to SCOTUS. So it's ridiculous to act like this will never happen when Trump has stacked the judiciary.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.